Alongside the heads, Olmec art teams with supernatural imagery, the so-called jaguar motif, infant-like figures with almond-shaped eyes, cleft foreheads, and downturned jaguar mouths, has been interpreted as representations of rain spirits, maize deities, or liminal beings that embody transformation. Such figures appear on jade celts, small figurines, and monumental carvings, suggesting that transformation between human and animal, ruler and god, life and death, was central to Olmec cosmology. Other motifs include serpents, symbolizing water and fertility, caves and clefts, representing portals to the underworld, and feathered creatures that may prefigure the later feathered serpent deities of Mesoamerican religion. The Olmecs created a symbolic grammar, a set of recurring images that allowed them to express ideas of fertility, renewal, rulership, and cosmic balance without words. Architecture reinforced these ideas. At La Venta, the largest Olmec center after San Lorenzo, a massive clay pyramid rose 30 meters above the swampy plain. Though lacking stone, its carefully layered earth created an artificial mountain, a symbolic axis mundi linking earth and sky. Around it, plazas held caches of jade and serpentine, arranged in mosaics and buried in layers that seemed to reenact cosmological myths. One such offering, massive blocks of serpentine arranged into a jagged green mosaic, then covered with earth, was never meant to be seen by human eyes. Its purpose was ritual, a gift to the underworld, a cosmic inscription hidden from view. This deliberate burial reveals a conception of ritual as performance not only for human audiences, but for gods and ancestors, a practice that wove belief directly into the landscape. Rulership in Olmec society was likewise a cosmological act. Thrones carved from basalt depict rulers seated within cave-like niches, emerging from clefts that symbolize portals to other realms. These images suggest that rulers were conceived as mediators between worlds, embodying the connection between sky, earth, and underworld. Authority was not only political, it was sacred stewardship, a responsibility to maintain cosmic balance. When rulers sat upon thrones, they did so not merely as human leaders, but as embodiments of cosmic order. The colossal heads, therefore, may not only represent rulers, but rulers as cosmos, their visages monumentalized to signal continuity between human governance and divine forces. Ritual was the glue that bound art, architecture, and rulership together. Offerings of jade celts, serpentine mosaics, rubber balls, and even human remains testify to ceremonies of sacrifice and renewal. At El Manati, a sacred spring, archaeologists uncovered extraordinary deposits, wooden busts carved with human faces, rubber balls, jade objects, and the remains of infants. Such offerings, placed in water over centuries, suggest rituals tied to fertility, rain, and rebirth. The spring itself was a portal to the underworld, and by casting offerings into its depths, the Olmecs ensured the continuation of cycles that sustained both agriculture and society. These rituals were not peripheral but central, enacted by rulers whose authority rested upon their ability to mediate between human community and divine cosmos. One of the most profound legacies of the Olmecs is the ritual ball game. Rubber balls found at El Manati confirm that the game was already practiced in Olmec times, centuries before the stone ball courts of the Maya and Aztecs. The ball game was more than sport, it was symbolic theater. The bouncing ball, moving back and forth across the court, enacted cosmic dualities, day and night, life and death, order and chaos. Later Mesoamerican myths, such as the Maya hero twins in the Popol Vuh, preserve the ball game as a narrative of struggle, sacrifice, and rebirth. That this symbolic practice appears first among the Olmecs testifies to their role in establishing traditions that endured for 2 millennia. The ball game was a ritual of cosmic balance, and its origins among the Olmecs highlight their role as innovators of sacred drama. Influence is perhaps the most contentious aspect of Olmec legacy. Did the Maya inherit writing and calendrical reckoning from Olmec prototypes? Did Zapotec glyphs draw inspiration from Gulf Coast symbols? Were Teotihuacan's pyramids conscious echoes of La Venta's clay mound? Scholars debate these questions vigorously, weighing evidence of diffusion against possibilities of independent invention. Yet parallels abound. The earliest long count date inscribed on a stela from Tres Zapotes situates the Olmecs at the dawn of Mesoamerican temporal science. Olmec-style motifs spread widely, appearing on pottery and figurines far beyond the Gulf Coast. Urban planning at La Venta, with its cardinal orientations and pyramidal focus, foreshadows Teotihuacan's Avenue of the Dead and the Aztec Templo Mayor. The Maya conception of divine kingship, in which rulers embodied gods and maintained cosmic order, resonates strongly with Olmec precedents. Even if every detail was not transmitted directly, the broad outlines of Mesoamerican civilization, sacred kingship, monumental pyramids, ritual ball games, cosmological symbolism, bear the indelible imprint of Olmec innovation. Yet the Olmecs also remain enigmatic. We do not know the names of their rulers, the exact shape of their myths, or the precise workings of their political systems. Their decline, too, is obscure. San Lorenzo was abandoned around 1000 BCE, perhaps due to environmental degradation, shifting trade routes, or political upheaval. La Venta, the great clay pyramid rising above the swamps, was deliberately buried and destroyed around 400 BCE, its monuments broken and interred in ritual closure. Tres Zapotes continued into the early Classic period, but the Olmecs as a coherent civilization faded, leaving behind fragments of influence scattered across Mesoamerica. Their disappearance invites speculation, but the truth remains shrouded in silence. What endures are their monuments, their symbols, and their echoes in later cultures. Modern encounters with the Olmecs add another layer of legacy. In Mexico, they have become icons of national identity, their colossal heads reproduced in museums and public spaces as symbols of indigenous antiquity. At the same time, speculative theories persist, echoing Melgar's 19th century comparison of the heads to Africans. Writers have suggested exotic origins, voyagers from Africa, the Mediterranean, or even Atlantis. Serious scholarship rejects these notions, emphasizing instead the independent development of Olmec civilization. Yet the persistence of such fantasies reveals the fascination the Olmecs continue to inspire. Their art seems so accomplished, their monuments so imposing, that they invite projection of lost connections, hidden origins, or forgotten continents. In this way, the Olmecs straddle a line between scholarly reconstruction and popular imagination, between archaeology and myth-making. Civilizations do not emerge suddenly from the void, nor do they spring forth fully formed like Athena from the head of Zeus. They crystallize gradually out of older traditions, transforming subsistence economies into more complex structures of belief, power, and artistry. Yet for every culture area of the world, scholars search for that critical moment when scattered communities converged into the first sustained experiment in civilization. In Mesopotamia, that role has long been assigned to the Sumerians of Uruk and Eridu. In Egypt, to the Old Kingdom pharaohs who raised the pyramids at Giza. In South Asia, to the builders of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa. And in China, to the Shang dynasty with its oracle bones and bronze vessels. For Mesoamerica, the cultural region that encompasses southern Mexico, Guatemala, and parts of Central America, this search for origins has led almost inevitably to the Olmecs. The Olmecs, flourishing between roughly 1500 and 400 BCE, stand at the beginning of recorded cultural time in the Americas. Their colossal heads, carved from basalt boulders dragged from the distant Tuxtla Mountains, stare at us with impassive authority. Their jade figurines, finely polished and enigmatic, speak of ritual worlds we can only partly reconstruct. Their ceremonial centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, and later Tres Zapotes, mark the transition from dispersed villages to complex urban formations. To speak of the Olmecs is therefore to speak of beginnings, of the first great experiment in sacred kingship, monumental labor, and symbolic art in the Americas. But beginnings are always contested, and the very title often given to the Olmecs, the mother culture of Mesoamerica, has sparked decades of debate, enthusiasm, and resistance. The phrase mother culture is at once evocative and problematic. It conjures a singular source from which all later civilizations, Maya, Zapotec, Teotihuacan, Aztec, drew their inspiration. Instead, the record reveals a mosaic of interactions, parallel developments, and cultural borrowings, all of which complicate the metaphor of motherhood. Did the Olmecs truly invent the ritual ball game, the long count calendar, the symbolic grammar of jaguars and serpents that persisted for 2,000 years? Or were they one of several contemporaneous societies experimenting in similar directions, influencing and being influenced in turn? This debate, mother culture versus sister cultures, sits at the very heart of Mesoamerican studies. It forces us to ask what we mean by origins, and whether influence flows in one direction or radiates outward through complex networks of exchange. On one side, scholars emphasize the early radiocarbon dates of San Lorenzo and La Venta, which predate other centers by centuries, and argue that the Olmecs provided the blueprint later civilizations elaborated. On the other, researchers stress that Oaxaca, the Valley of Mexico, and the Maya lowlands each had their own autonomous traditions, which interacted with but were not dictated by the Gulf Coast. Neither side fully wins the argument, and perhaps neither should. For the Olmecs are best understood not as a solitary mother, nor as an indistinct sibling, but as the first society to crystallize a set of principles, sacred rulership, monumental architecture, cosmological alignment, that would echo across centuries in diverse and creative ways. What makes the Olmecs so compelling, however, is not only their antiquity but their rediscovery. Unlike the Maya, who left thousands of glyphic inscriptions, or the Aztecs, whose history was recorded by Spanish chroniclers, the Olmecs were almost entirely silent in the written record. They remained buried beneath jungle soils and local memory until the 19th and 20th centuries. The story of their rediscovery, with all its misunderstandings and speculative theories, reveals as much about modern anxieties and fascinations as it does about the ancient Gulf Coast. The first stirrings of recognition came in 1862 when José María Melgar y Serrano, a Mexican antiquarian, stumbled across a colossal stone head near Tres Zapotes. Struck by its features, Melgar compared it to an Ethiopian, projecting onto the artifact a racialized interpretation that reflected 19th century obsessions with foreign origins and diffusion. For decades, such finds remained curiosities, disconnected from broader narratives of Mesoamerican history. Only in the 1920s and 1930s, when Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge documented monuments in Veracruz and Tabasco, did the outline of a distinct civilization begin to emerge. Even then, uncertainty reigned. Were these sculptures the work of Maya ancestors, a peripheral group, or something entirely new? It was Matthew Stirling, working with the Smithsonian Institution in the 1930s through 1950s, who transformed the Olmecs from mystery to foundational culture. His excavations at Tres Zapotes, San Lorenzo, and La Venta uncovered colossal heads, thrones, altars, and caches of jade and serpentine, all in situ, demonstrating beyond doubt that these monuments belonged to a coherent civilization. Stirling argued that the Olmecs were older than the Maya, contemporaneous with or even preceding the earliest highland states, and thus represented the true beginning of Mesoamerican civilization. His conclusions, bold at the time, reshaped the field. Suddenly, the Gulf Coast was no longer a backwater, but the cradle of complexity. Yet Stirling's interpretation also cemented the mother culture label, sparking decades of debate. For Mexican archaeology in the mid-20th century, this label had powerful resonance. It situated the nation's pre-Hispanic past within a grand narrative of origins, offering the Olmecs as the shared ancestors of all later indigenous peoples. In a period of nation-building and cultural affirmation, the colossal heads became symbols of antiquity and unity, their monumental visages reproduced in museums, textbooks, and public art. To identify the Olmecs as the first Mexicans was to assert continuity, legitimacy, and pride. But the same label also drew critique. Scholars worried that it obscured diversity, reducing a mosaic of independent civilizations into a linear genealogy. Indigenous voices warned that it imposed centralization onto a past that was far more plural and localized. Anthropologists questioned whether influence should be understood as unilateral transmission or as multidirectional exchange. The mother culture debate, therefore, is not a mere academic quarrel. It reflects broader tensions about identity, heritage, and the politics of origins. Framing the Olmecs alongside other first civilizations illuminates both their achievements and their uniqueness. Like the Sumerians, they appear as innovators in writing and calendrical reckoning, though their evidence remains fragmentary and contested. Like Egypt, they built monumental architecture, pyramidal mounds at La Venta, that symbolized cosmic order. Like the Shang, they developed a rich iconography of animals and supernatural beings that fused art with cosmology. Yet unlike these old-world civilizations, the Olmecs emerged without contact or diffusion, a reminder that the Americas were fully capable of independent invention. When San Lorenzo flourished between 1200 and 1000 BCE, the Mycenaean palaces had fallen, Egypt's new kingdom was waning, and Zhou kings ruled China. The Olmecs, far from being peripheral, were contemporaries of the world's great civilizations, unfolding in their own hemisphere, their achievements no less remarkable for their isolation. To speak of origins is also to confront evidentiary limits. The Olmecs left no extended texts. Their glyphs, if indeed the Cascajal block represents true writing, are tantalizing fragments. Their language is thought to belong to the mixed Zocoian family, but we cannot hear their words or reconstruct their myths in detail. What we know comes from archaeology, stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, iconographic analysis. Every interpretation is provisional, filtered through analogies with later cultures and the biases of our own scholarly moment. To call them the first is therefore not simply to describe a fact, but to interpret a set of material remains through a particular lens of modern inquiry. And yet, despite these uncertainties, the Olmecs remain unavoidable in any discussion of Mesoamerican origins. Their art, architecture, and cosmology set patterns that resonate throughout the region's history. Their colossal heads embody rulership, their altars symbolize portals to the underworld, their buried offerings testify to rituals of fertility and renewal. Their jade figurines, traded far beyond their homeland, spread motifs that became a shared symbolic language. In their blend of innovation, monumentality, and cosmological imagination, they crystallized what it meant to be Mesoamerican. Thus, the study of the Olmecs is not only about reconstructing a lost civilization, but about wrestling with the very concept of beginnings. Do we seek a single origin, a mother culture that gave birth to all that followed? Or do we embrace multiplicity, a chorus of voices shaping the region together? The Olmecs force us to confront this question, not only because of their antiquity, but because of the fascination they continue to inspire. They are at once shadowy and monumental, elusive yet indispensable. They are beginnings, but beginnings refracted, contested, and endlessly reinterpreted. To understand the Olmecs, one must begin with their land. Civilizations are not merely shaped by human will. They are forged in dialogue with their environments, which provide both the opportunities for flourishing and the obstacles that demand ingenuity. The Olmecs emerged not in the arid valleys of highland Mexico, nor in the temperate plateaus where later cities would rise, but in the humid, waterlogged lowlands of the Gulf Coast, stretching across what are today the states of Veracruz and Tabasco. To outside eyes, this was a challenging landscape, swamps stretching as far as the horizon, rivers winding and flooding with seasonal force, and oppressive humidity that made daily life arduous. Yet within this watery world, the Olmecs carved out the first great experiment in Mesoamerican civilization. The geography of the Gulf Coast lowlands is defined by water. The Coatzacoalcos, Tonala, and Papaloapan rivers, along with countless tributaries, carried rich volcanic sediments down from the Sierra de los Tuxtlas and adjacent highlands. These sediments replenished the floodplains year after year, creating soils of remarkable fertility. Floods, while destructive, also renewed the land, echoing patterns seen in other riverine cradles of civilization. Just as the Nile floods sustained Egyptian agriculture, and the Tigris and Euphrates floods nourished Mesopotamian fields, the rivers of the Gulf Coast offered the Olmecs both bounty and challenge. The difference lay in climate. Where the Nile Valley depended on scarce and predictable floods, the Gulf Coast faced torrential rains, sweltering humidity, and floods that could devastate settlements as easily as they enriched them. To thrive in such conditions required adaptation, resilience, and a worldview that saw water not merely as hazard, but as sacred force. San Lorenzo, the earliest Olmec capital, illustrates this relationship vividly. Built upon a natural ridge above the floodplain, the site was carefully chosen to provide both protection from inundations and access to surrounding fertile lands. From this elevated vantage point, Olmec rulers oversaw not only their people, but also the flows of water and trade that sustained their civilization. Archaeological evidence reveals that the inhabitants engineered the ridge extensively, cutting terraces, flattening surfaces, and constructing basalt-lined drains that channeled water across the ceremonial precinct. These hydraulic systems were feats of both engineering and ritual, practical in their management of rainfall, but also symbolic, transforming water into a visible manifestation of cosmic order. Water coursing through stone conduits was no mere runoff. It was a controlled display, a dramatization of human mastery and divine sanction. The Olmec heartland was also defined by swamps, vast expanses of wetlands that might appear inhospitable but offered rich resources. Fish, turtles, birds, and amphibians thrived in these waters, supplementing the Olmec diet. More importantly, the Olmecs learned to transform the margins of swamps into agricultural land. Archaeological studies suggest that they dug channels, raised fields, and modified levees to create stable zones of cultivation. Rather than fleeing the wetlands, they embraced them, making the swamp itself part of their world. In symbolic terms, swamps were not just resources but liminal spaces, thresholds between surface and underworld, domains of fertility deities and rain spirits. To bury offerings in watery places, as at the sacred spring of El Manati, was to return life to the womb of the earth, to ensure cycles of renewal. Here, environment and cosmology intertwined seamlessly. Water was both sustenance and sacred portal. Agriculture lay at the foundation of this world. The Olmecs relied upon the great Mesoamerican triad of maize, beans, and squash, a set of crops that, when cultivated together, provided balanced nutrition and ecological sustainability. Maize offered carbohydrates, beans supplied protein, and squash contributed vitamins and ground cover to protect soils. This triad was not only efficient but symbolic. Interdependence in the field reflected interdependence in society and cosmos. Maize, in particular, occupied a central place in Olmec subsistence and religion. Grinding stones, carbonized remains, and iconography of cleft-headed figures suggest its deep cultural significance. Later traditions among the Maya, who believed humanity was created from maize dough, illuminate what Olmec beliefs may have foreshadowed: that maize was life itself, both food and divine substance. But maize was only part of the Olmec agricultural repertoire. Cacao, native to the humid lowlands, provided a beverage of prestige and ritual importance, its frothy bitterness associated with elites and communion with the gods. Residue analysis from Olmec vessels indicates its use as early as 1800 BCE, making the Olmecs perhaps the first to ritualize cacao in Mesoamerican culture. Rubber, too, was distinctive to their environment. By mixing latex from the Castilla elastica tree with juice from morning glory vines, the Olmecs invented vulcanization centuries before Goodyear, producing resilient rubber for waterproofing and for balls used in the ritual ball game. The very name Olmec, a Nahuatl word meaning rubber people, reflects this enduring association. To live in the Olmec heartland was to transform abundance into culture, turning swamps into fields, maize into cosmology, cacao into ritual, and rubber into sacred play. The Olmecs also tapped into distant resources through expansive trade networks. Basalt for their colossal heads came from the volcanic Tuxtla Mountains, some 60 kilometers away, requiring extraordinary feats of transport across rivers and swamps. Jade, prized above all for its luminous green color and associations with fertility and life, came from the Motagua Valley in present-day Guatemala, hundreds of kilometers distant. Obsidian, valued for its sharpness and sheen, was imported from the highlands of central Mexico. These materials were not only economic but symbolic. Jade celts buried in mosaic patterns beneath La Venta's plazas embodied fertility, while basalt drains and altars carried the volcanic essence of mountains into ceremonial spaces. Every quarry, every transport, every carving was thus both a technological achievement and a cosmological act. To command jade and basalt was to command life, fertility, and divine power. Archaeology provides the means to reconstruct these achievements, but it also underscores the limitations of our knowledge. Without long texts, scholars rely on stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, and iconographic interpretation. At San Lorenzo, stratified ceramics chart the rise and decline of the site between 1400 and 1000 BCE. At La Venta, radiocarbon samples date the Great Clay Pyramid and ritual caches to between 1000 and 400 BCE. Iconography, meanwhile, opens windows into cosmology. Rulers depicted emerging from cave-like thrones, infants with jaguar features representing rain or maize spirits, serpents and cleft mountains symbolizing portals between worlds. Yet interpretation is fraught with risk. Are we projecting later Maya and Aztec meanings back onto Olmec symbols? Are we mistaking artistic convention for religious doctrine? The answers are never certain, and each new discovery reshapes the conversation. One of the most tantalizing pieces of evidence is the Cascajal block, discovered in 1999, inscribed with 62 distinct symbols arranged in rows. Dated to around 900 BCE, it may represent the earliest writing system in the Americas. If authentic, it would place the Olmecs at the dawn of Mesoamerican literacy, centuries before Zapotec or Maya scripts. But the block's isolated context and undeciphered symbols leave debate unresolved. It stands as a reminder of how fragile our reconstructions are. A single artifact can promise revolutionary insight, yet remain enigmatic, suspended between proof and possibility. Despite these uncertainties, the broad contours are clear. The Olmecs were not a marginal people eking out survival in swamps. They were innovators who transformed a challenging environment into a sacred landscape. They engineered ridges, raised mounds, and constructed hydraulic systems to master water. They cultivated crops with ecological sophistication, embedding sustenance into cosmology. They commanded long-distance trade in jade and obsidian, weaving the Gulf Coast into a pan-Mesoamerican network of exchange. And they monumentalized their world in colossal sculptures and clay pyramids, inscribing their vision into earth and stone. The Olmec heartland was not only habitable, it was habited with meaning, every river a serpent, every spring an entrance to the underworld, every mountain a dwelling of gods. In contextualizing the Olmecs, we see that their genius lay not merely in what they invented, but in how they integrated environment, economy, and cosmology into a coherent system. Their world was fluid, both literally and symbolically, floods rising and receding, rivers winding across plains, rulers mediating between underworld and sky. To live in the Gulf Coast lowlands was to live in constant negotiation with water, fertility, and transformation. The Olmecs did not resist this fluidity. They embraced it, embedding it into their art, their rituals, and their conception of kingship. In doing so, they laid down a pattern that would endure throughout Mesoamerican history. That civilization is not imposed upon nature but woven into its cycles, that order is not static but dynamic, and that rulers must stand at the center of this negotiation, embodying the balance between human society and cosmic forces. The Olmecs speak to us most directly through their art. When writing is scarce or undeciphered, when myths are unrecoverable in their full form, images become our primary interlocutors. And the Olmecs were masterful image makers. Their colossal heads, jade figurines, thrones, and altars convey both the individuality of rulers and the universality of cosmological themes. To stand before a basalt head from San Lorenzo is to confront both a portrait of power and a symbol of sacred kingship. Each head, some weighing more than 20 tons, was carved with distinctive features, lips, noses, helmets that suggest real individuals. Yet they are more than portraits. Their scale transforms them into embodiments of rulership itself, monumental visages that endure beyond the life of any one person, guardians of authority that gaze impassively across the centuries. The enduring mystery of the Olmecs is part of their appeal. They are at once central and shadowy, the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, yet known only through fragments. They left no epic texts like the Maya, no imperial chronicles like the Aztecs. They speak through stone, through jade, through earth and water. To study them is to confront both the potential and the limits of archaeology, to piece together a world from colossal heads, buried offerings, and stratified sherds. Their silence challenges us to imagine, to interpret cautiously, to balance evidence with humility. And yet, despite this silence, the Olmecs endure as a threshold civilization. They stand at the beginning of Mesoamerican history, their achievements foreshadowing everything that would follow. When the Maya calculated the cycles of Venus, when the Zapotec carved glyphs into stone, when the Aztecs raised the Templo Mayor to replicate the cosmic mountain, they were elaborating themes first articulated by the Olmecs. Their influence was not mechanical but inspirational, not a rigid blueprint, but a set of principles that rulers mediate between gods and humans, that cities embody the cosmos, that art encodes cosmology, that ritual sustains the cycles of fertility and renewal. These principles, born in the swamps and ridges of Veracruz and Tabasco, became the foundations of Mesoamerican civilization. In the end, the Olmecs remind us that beginnings are never simple. They are not origins in the sense of absolute firsts, but origins as thresholds, moments when scattered traditions crystallize into coherent form, when landscapes are reshaped into sacred space, when art and ritual intertwine to express cosmic order. To call the Olmecs the mother culture is to recognize their priority and influence. To call them a sister culture is to acknowledge the diversity and multiplicity of Mesoamerica. Both perspectives contain truth. What matters is that the Olmecs, in their monumental heads, their buried offerings, their clay pyramids, and their sacred springs, captured for the first time the essence of what it meant to be Mesoamerican. Thus, as we turn the pages of their story, we must approach with both wonder and humility. Wonder at their creativity, their mastery of environment, their symbolic imagination. Humility at the limits of our knowledge, the silences of their texts, the fragility of the evidence. The Olmecs endure as both presence and absence, as monumental stone and as enigmatic echo. They are the shadows at the dawn of Mesoamerican civilization, the legacy that shaped centuries of culture, the enigma that continues to inspire scholars and seekers alike. The mother culture of Mesoamerica. The story of the Olmecs begins in the lush, waterlogged lowlands of the Gulf Coast of Mexico, where rivers coiled like serpents through fertile plains and swamps, and volcanic ridges rose like the backs of sleeping beasts from the jungle floor. It is here, amid the steaming humidity and seasonal floods, that a civilization took shape more than 3 millennia ago, an ancient people whose identity has come down to us through colossal stone heads, mysterious symbols carved on jade, and a cultural legacy that rippled outward through time like concentric rings in a pool of still water. To the modern scholar and the broader public, the Olmecs occupy a paradoxical position, simultaneously shadowy and central, elusive and monumental, half forgotten yet indispensable to the story of ancient America. They are often called the Madre Cultura, the mother culture, of Mesoamerica, a title that has sparked both admiration and controversy. But whether one embraces or resists that epithet, there is no denying that the Olmecs established many of the cornerstones upon which later civilizations, the Maya, the Zapotec, the Teotihuacanos, and the Aztec, would build their own empires of stone, myth, and blood. The Olmecs were not the first people to inhabit the region. Generations of small-scale agricultural communities had already tamed maize, beans, squash, and cacao. Yet the Olmecs transformed these subsistence patterns into something greater, a civilization that commanded resources, organized monumental labor, and infused its cities with cosmological meaning. Their art astonishes with its refinement. The soft curves of jade figurines, the stern visages of colossal basalt heads, and the enigmatic motifs of jaguars, serpents, and rulers depicted as beings standing at the threshold between the human and divine. Their political centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, and later Tres Zapotes, were not mere villages but carefully planned nodes of ritual and authority, where rulers presided over ceremonies designed to align earthly order with celestial rhythms. To call them the first great civilization of Mesoamerica is not an exaggeration but a recognition of their enduring influence. Like Sumer in Mesopotamia or Egypt along the Nile, the Olmecs represent a formative stage of cultural crystallization, the point where scattered traditions coalesced into a template that subsequent cultures would inherit, adapt, and transform. Just as the pyramids of Giza became an eternal reference point for Egyptian kingship, the colossal heads of San Lorenzo and La Venta became enduring emblems of rulership, authority, and sacred power in Mesoamerica. And just as Sumer's cuneiform tablets initiated the record-keeping systems of the Near East, the Olmecs' early glyphic symbols hinted at the birth of writing and calendrical reckoning in the New World. Yet the Olmecs were more than just a starting point. They were innovators, pioneers of religious iconography and ceremonial architecture, custodians of an ideology that sought to bind the human ruler with the cosmic forces of fertility, rainfall, and renewal. In their worldview, the world itself was a sacred stage, and every mound, plaza, or sculpted monument was an expression of this cosmic order. They engineered landscapes not only for defense or sustenance, but for meaning. Platforms raised above swampy ground became mountains in miniature, symbolic replicas of the primeval hills from which gods and ancestors emerged. Altars doubled as thrones and portals, linking rulers with supernatural realms. Rivers and springs were seen as entrances to the watery underworld, inhabited by deities of rain, maize, and fertility. The Olmecs also mastered networks of exchange, drawing obsidian from the distant highlands, jade from Guatemala, and serpentine from nearby ranges. Through these exchanges, they spread not only goods but ideas. Across Mesoamerica, from the Valley of Mexico to the Pacific coast of Chiapas, Olmec-style motifs appear on figurines, pottery, and monuments. The downturned jaguar mouth, the cleft head, the supernatural infant, all became part of a visual language that signaled participation in a broader ideological horizon. To be Olmec, or to be influenced by them, was to partake in a shared set of symbols that gave coherence to otherwise diverse communities. The grandeur of this achievement is all the more remarkable when we consider its antiquity. San Lorenzo flourished from roughly 1400 to 1000 BCE, centuries before the rise of Monte Alban, Teotihuacan, or the classic Maya cities of the Pedon. When Egypt's new kingdom was waning, when Mycenaean palaces lay in ruins, and when the Zhou dynasty was asserting itself in China, the Olmecs were carving their colossal heads and erecting earthen clay platforms in the Gulf Coast jungles. Their world was not peripheral or primitive. It was a parallel cradle of civilization, unfolding in a hemisphere that developed independently of the Old World. Framing the Olmecs as the first great civilization also requires acknowledging how we know them, through archaeology, through fragmentary remains, and through interpretations that are inevitably shaped by modern questions and assumptions. Unlike the Maya, they left no long texts to explain themselves. Unlike the Aztecs, they were not described in detail by Spanish chroniclers. They are known instead through stones, sherds, and buried offerings, through alignments of platforms and the faint traces of ritual deposits. These remains must be coaxed into coherence, interpreted through analogies with later cultures, and with a sensitivity to the silences of the archaeological record. Yet despite the gaps, the Olmecs emerge unmistakably as a people of extraordinary vision. Their colossal heads, some weighing more than 20 tons, testify to an ability to mobilize labor on a massive scale. Their carefully aligned ceremonial centers reveal an awareness of cosmic order and calendrical cycles. Their art suggests a fascination with transformation, liminality, and the blending of human and animal, ruler and deity. All these features, monumentality, sacred rulership, cosmic alignment, artistic sophistication, are hallmarks of civilization. And in Mesoamerica, the Olmecs were the first to combine them into a coherent and enduring whole. In this sense, to frame the Olmecs as the first great civilization is to acknowledge both their achievements and their role as cultural progenitors. They were not isolated curiosities, but active shapers of a tradition that extended for millennia. When the Maya calculated the movements of Venus, when the Zapotecs carved glyphs into stone, when the Aztecs raised the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, they were participating, consciously or unconsciously, in a legacy first articulated by the Olmecs. Their civilization set the tone for what it meant to be Mesoamerican, to see the cosmos as a sacred order, to embed that order in cities and monuments, and to bind human society to the cycles of the gods. The modern rediscovery of the Olmecs was not a straightforward revelation, but a gradual awakening, pieced together by generations of explorers, antiquarians, and archaeologists, who at first could hardly believe what they were seeing. For centuries after the Spanish conquest, the colossal heads of San Lorenzo and La Venta lay buried in jungle soil or obscured in local villages, their features only occasionally noted by passing travelers. Unlike the temples of the Maya that rose dramatically above the forest canopy, or the pyramids of central Mexico that dominated valleys, the Olmec monuments were often concealed beneath layers of earth. What survived above ground was fragmentary and enigmatic, massive stone carvings without inscriptions, strange figurines traded far beyond their homeland, and mounds that looked more like natural rises than deliberate architecture. It would take the careful work of archaeology in the 20th century to bring the Olmecs fully into the light, and even then, debates over their identity and legacy would rage. One of the first figures to draw scholarly attention to the Gulf Coast monuments was José María Melgar y Serrano, a Mexican explorer and antiquarian. In 1862, while traveling in the state of Veracruz, Melgar encountered what would later be known as the colossal head of Hueyapan, now Tres Zapotes Monument A. Astonished by its features, he described it as resembling an Ethiopian, a comparison reflecting both the racialized lens of 19th century observers and the sheer novelty of the find. For Melgar, and for many who followed, the head suggested a mysterious foreign presence in ancient Mexico, perhaps African or even Atlantean in origin. Such speculations, though far removed from archaeological reality, highlight the sense of disorientation early scholars felt when confronted with artifacts that did not easily fit into existing frameworks of Mesoamerican history. For decades after Melgar's report, the Olmecs remained more rumor than reality. It was not until the 1920s and 1930s, when archaeologists like Franz Blom and Oliver Lafarge traveled through southern Veracruz and Tabasco, that systematic documentation began. Their surveys revealed that the colossal heads were not isolated curiosities, but part of a broader corpus of monumental sculpture, including thrones, altars, and stelae. Blom and Lafarge published photographs of these works, bringing them to wider scholarly attention. Yet even then, the identity of the culture that produced them was uncertain. Were they ancestors of the Maya? A branch of some central Mexican people? Or an entirely distinct civilization? The very idea of an early foundational culture in Mesoamerica was only beginning to take shape. The breakthrough came in the mid-20th century, largely through the work of Matthew Stirling, an archaeologist with the Smithsonian Institution who led excavations at Tres Zapotes, La Venta, and San Lorenzo between the 1930s and 1950s. Stirling's teams uncovered caches of jade figurines, buried offerings of serpentine blocks, and, most significantly, the colossal heads in situ, demonstrating that they were not isolated artifacts, but part of planned ceremonial complexes. Stirling argued that the Olmecs represented a distinct culture, older than the Maya and Zapotec, and perhaps the progenitors of Mesoamerican civilization. His proposals were bold and at first controversial, but over time the weight of evidence supported his claim. Central to this debate was the issue of chronology. Without extensive written records, archaeologists relied on stratigraphy, ceramic sequences, and radiocarbon dating to establish timelines. By the mid-20th century, it became clear that San Lorenzo, with its great basalt monuments, flourished as early as 1200 BCE, centuries before the earliest known Maya cities. La Venta, with its towering clay pyramid and vast ritual deposits, thrived between 1000 and 400 BCE, overlapping with and predating many contemporaneous cultures. The Olmecs were thus pushed deeper into antiquity, emerging as the first great civilization of Mesoamerica, rather than a peripheral offshoot of later powers. Not all scholars accepted this view without resistance. In the 1960s and 1970s, a fierce debate emerged between mother culture and sister culture proponents. The mother culture camp, influenced by Stirling's discoveries, argued that the Olmecs provided the foundational template for later Mesoamerican civilizations. Monumental architecture, calendrical reckoning, glyphic symbols, ritual ball games, and divine rulership all had their roots in Olmec society. The sister culture perspective, by contrast, maintained that Mesoamerica was a mosaic of interrelated but independent cultures, and that the Olmecs were one among many, not uniquely central. According to this view, similarities between later cultures and the Olmecs arose from parallel development and exchange rather than direct inheritance. This debate was not purely academic. It reflected broader tensions in the interpretation of history. To call the Olmecs the mother culture was to suggest a hierarchy, with one people standing at the head of a civilizational lineage. To frame them as a sister culture emphasized diversity, interaction, and shared development. Both views had merit, and both were supported by evidence. Olmec-style artifacts traveled far beyond the Gulf Coast, showing wide influence, yet local traditions persisted across regions, showing resilience and autonomy. What became clear, however, was that the Olmecs could no longer be dismissed as a marginal or enigmatic people. They were central to any understanding of the ancient Americas. Archaeology itself was transforming during this period, and these changes shaped how the Olmecs were studied. Early expeditions had focused on monumental art and elite centers, but by the late 20th century, archaeologists turned increasingly to settlement patterns, household archaeology, and environmental studies. Excavations at San Lorenzo revealed not only colossal heads, but also evidence of elite residences, workshops, and hydraulic systems. Studies of La Venta uncovered vast offerings of serpentine blocks buried beneath ceremonial plazas, hinting at a ritual cosmology tied to the underworld. At Tres Zapotes, later Olmec phases showed continuity into the early Classic period, challenging neat narratives of rise and fall. Each discovery complicated the picture, showing the Olmecs as both unique and interconnected, innovative yet embedded in broader Mesoamerican networks. The debates over their legacy extended beyond academic circles. The Olmecs became symbols of Mexican national identity, invoked in discussions of indigenous heritage and cultural origins. Their colossal heads, with their commanding features and helmets, were reproduced in museums, textbooks, and public art. To many, they represented the dignity and antiquity of Mexico's pre-Hispanic past. a reminder that civilization had flourished in the Americas long before European arrival. Yet interpretations varied. Were the heads portraits of rulers, depictions of ball players, or representations of deities? Each theory carried implications for how the Olmecs were imagined, whether as pragmatic leaders, ritual athletes, or mythic visionaries. Archaeological debates also intersected with more speculative interpretations. Some writers, inspired by Melgor's original comparison, continue to suggest exotic origins for the Olmecs, African voyagers, Old World seafarers, even Atlanteans. Such theories, though lacking evidence, reflected the enduring fascination the Olmecs inspired. Their art seemed so accomplished, so strikingly different from expectations, that outsiders could not resist projecting fantasies upon them. Serious scholarship rejected these ideas, emphasizing instead the indigenous roots and independent development of Olmec civilization. Yet the persistence of such alternative narratives reveals how the Olmecs occupy a liminal space in the imagination, simultaneously familiar and alien, deeply American yet suggestive of lost connections. By the early 21st century, consensus had emerged on certain points. The Olmecs were a distinct civilization, flourishing from roughly 1500 to 400 BCE, centered in the Gulf Coast lowlands. Their major centers, San Lorenzo, La Venta, and Tres Zapotes, were hubs of political and ritual authority. Their art and ideology influenced wide regions, laying foundations for later Mesoamerican cultures. Yet questions remained. How exactly did their political systems function? What was the nature of their religion? How centralized was their authority? And to what extent were they innovators versus participants in a broader web of exchange? These questions continue to animate scholarship, ensuring that debates over their legacy remain vibrant. Thus, the archaeology of the Olmecs is not simply about uncovering stones and shards. It is about reconstructing a lost world and negotiating its meaning in the present. The colossal heads stare at us with impassive eyes, challenging us to understand the society that carved them. The buried offerings of La Venta whisper of rituals whose chants and dances have long since faded. The settlement remains of San Lorenzo speak of ordinary lives lived under the shadow of extraordinary rulers. And the scholarly debates, mother culture versus sister culture, influence versus parallelism, remind us that history is never static but always contested, always refracted through the lenses of our own time. The study of the Olmecs, perhaps more than any other ancient Mesoamerican culture, is a reminder of both the power and the limitations of archaeology as a discipline. Unlike the Maya with their carved stelae or the Aztecs with their colonial codices and Spanish chroniclers, the Olmecs left behind no lengthy texts to narrate their history. They carved symbols that may have been the beginnings of writing, and they inscribed motifs that allude to cosmic ideas, but these remain tantalizing fragments rather than complete sentences. What survives of their world comes to us filtered through stone, earth, and time, buried offerings, stratified deposits of ceramics, monumental sculptures without explicit context, and alignments of earthen platforms whose meanings we must reconstruct. To approach the Olmecs is to accept that we are working at the limits of evidence, piecing together a civilization from echoes and shadows. Archaeologists rely on three principal methods to make sense of the Olmecs: stratigraphy, radiocarbon dating, and iconographic interpretation. Stratigraphy, the study of layers of soil and material, has been indispensable in establishing relative chronologies. At San Lorenzo, careful excavation revealed sequences of ceramics and architectural phases, allowing scholars to chart the rise and decline of the site between 1400 and 1000 BCE. At La Venta, stratified offerings, serpentine mosaics, jade figurines, caches of polished axes, were found buried beneath ceremonial plazas, providing a layered record of ritual activity over centuries. Each layer, each deposit represents a decision by the ancient inhabitants to bury, to build, or to abandon, and by analyzing these layers, archaeologists can reconstruct patterns of continuity and change. Yet stratigraphy alone cannot provide absolute dates. For that, radiocarbon dating has been essential. Charcoal, burned seeds, and organic remains recovered from Olmec sites have been subjected to radiocarbon analysis, anchoring relative sequences to specific centuries. It is through radiocarbon dating that we know San Lorenzo flourished around 1200 BCE, and that La Venta reached its zenith between 1000 and 400 BCE. These dates situate the Olmecs not as contemporaries of the classic Maya, but as their precursors, innovators in a deeper past. The precision of radiocarbon dating, however, is not absolute. Margins of error, contamination, and the calibration of results introduce uncertainties. Thus, while we can establish broad chronologies, exact years often remain elusive. Beyond stratigraphy and radiocarbon lies perhaps the most contentious method, iconographic interpretation. The Olmecs were masterful artists, and their sculptures and carvings teem with imagery: jaguars, serpents, cleft-headed infants, rulers, and supernatural guise. Scholars have long sought to decode these motifs, interpreting them as expressions of cosmology, shamanic transformation, or political ideology. A ruler carved emerging from a cave-like niche may be seen as an embodiment of the axis mundi, the world's central point connecting underworld, earth, and sky. A jaguar infant with downturned mouth and almond-shaped eyes may represent a rain spirit, a maize deity, or a symbol of royal legitimacy. Each interpretation offers insight, but each also carries risks. The risk of projecting later Mesoamerican meanings backward, the risk of reading too much into ambiguous forms, the risk of mistaking artistic convention for religious dogma. Iconography can illuminate, but it can also mislead. The evidentiary limits of Olmec studies are especially stark when it comes to writing. At Cascajal, a serpentine slab discovered in 1999 bears incised symbols that some scholars argue represent the earliest true writing system of the Americas. The slab, dated to around 900 BCE, contains 62 distinct signs arranged in horizontal rows, suggesting a structured text. If authentic, it would push back the origins of writing in Mesoamerica by centuries and attribute its invention to the Olmecs. Yet skepticism remains. The context of the find was not secure, the signs do not clearly match later scripts, and the sample is too small to confirm definitively. The Cascajal block is emblematic of the challenge. A tantalizing fragment, full of promise, but resting on fragile ground. Archaeology must therefore be complemented by other forms of evidence. Comparative analysis with later cultures provides one avenue: motifs found in Olmec art, such as the feathered serpent, the world tree, or the cleft mountain, recur in Maya and Aztec iconography, suggesting a continuity of ideas. Ethno-historical sources, though written millennia later, can sometimes offer clues, though these must be used cautiously. Environmental studies, including pollen analysis and geomorphology, shed light on how the Olmecs managed their watery landscape, constructing drainage systems and raising platforms above floodplains. Together, these methods create a mosaic of evidence, imperfect but compelling. Still, the Olmecs remain frustratingly elusive in many respects. We do not know the names of their rulers, the words of their prayers, or the full shape of their myths. We cannot reconstruct their languages with certainty, though mixed Zoquian languages are often suggested as descendants. We cannot pinpoint why San Lorenzo declined around 1000 BCE. Was it environmental degradation, political upheaval, or a shift in trade routes? We cannot fully explain why La Venta's monuments were deliberately buried and destroyed around 400 BCE. Was it ritual closure, conquest, or abandonment? These silences are not merely gaps in knowledge. They are reminders of the fragility of human memory and the selective survival of the past. The evidentiary limits also shape the debates about Olmec influence. Without texts, how do we trace ideas from one culture to another? How do we distinguish between direct inheritance and independent development? When a Maya stela shows a ruler emerging from a niche resembling an Olmec altar, is it imitation or parallel symbolism? When Zapotec glyphs appear centuries after Olmec motifs, are they descendants of an Olmec script or independent inventions? Archaeologists must navigate these questions with caution, balancing the allure of continuity with the rigor of evidence. Yet perhaps it is precisely these limits that make the Olmecs so compelling. The absence of definitive texts or linear narratives forces us to engage with their world through material culture, through the weight of basalt heads, the shimmer of jade, the geometry of plazas. It invites us to imagine how a civilization speaks through stone and earth, how meaning can be encoded in offerings buried beneath the ground. The Olmecs teach us that civilization is not only written in words but inscribed in landscapes, rituals, and symbols. In the end, the methods and limits of Olmec archaeology remind us of the provisional nature of historical knowledge. Each excavation uncovers new data, but also raises new questions. Each interpretation clarifies one aspect while casting another into doubt. The Olmecs emerge as both knowable and unknowable, their achievements undeniable, yet their inner life forever out of reach. They are a mirror in which we see both the potential of human creativity and the constraints of our ability to recover the past. When archaeologists call the Olmecs the mother culture, they are speaking less of bloodlines and more of blueprints. The influence of the Olmecs on later Mesoamerican civilizations is not a matter of one culture handing down a neatly wrapped package of traditions, but of patterns, ritual, architectural, and ideological, that reverberated through centuries, shifting and transforming as they were reinterpreted by new peoples. If we step back from the Gulf Coast swamps and look across the long arc of Mesoamerican history, we can see how Olmec precedents foreshadowed the towering pyramids of Teotihuacan, the elaborate rituals of the classic Maya, and the imperial grandeur of the Aztec world. The most striking of these continuities is in monumental architecture. At La Venta, the Olmecs raised one of the earliest pyramidal structures in the Americas, a massive clay mound, carefully shaped into a cone-like form, dominating the ceremonial precinct. It was not made of stone, as later Maya and Aztec pyramids would be, but of earth, layered and compacted with meticulous effort. Yet its symbolism was unmistakable: an artificial mountain, a man-made axis mundi linking earth and sky. In later centuries, this principle would be repeated on an ever grander scale. The pyramids of Teotihuacan, the Temple of the Inscriptions at Palenque, and the Templo Mayor at Tenochtitlan all echoed this Olmec notion of the sacred mountain as the central feature of urban design. Each was less about practical utility than about cosmological statement. The city itself was aligned with the heavens, anchored by a pyramid that replicated the primeval hill of creation. Equally enduring was the Olmec emphasis on the ruler as mediator between worlds. In Olmec art, rulers are often shown emerging from cave-like thrones or seated atop altars carved with supernatural motifs. These images suggest a conception of kingship not as mere political authority but as divine stewardship, a ruler's body and office serving as a channel between gods, ancestors, and the living. Later Maya kings took this idea to extraordinary heights, presenting themselves as embodiments of maize gods, sun deities, and world trees. At Copan, Quirigua, and Tikal, rulers were carved in stone as cosmic actors, their deeds tied to celestial cycles. The Aztec Tlatoani, too, ruled not just as military leaders, but as bearers of sacred responsibility, ensuring the continuation of the sun through ritual and sacrifice. In each case, the Olmec precedent is visible. The conception of rulership is sacred, the throne as altar, the monarch as axis between realms. Ritual ball games also connect the Olmecs to later civilizations. At El Manati, a sacred Olmec site, rubber balls were deposited as offerings alongside wooden busts and jade celts. These finds suggest that the ball game, later so central to Maya, Zapotec, and Aztec life, already held symbolic power in Olmec times. The ball game was never merely sport. It was ritual theater, a dramatization of cosmic dualities, life and death, day and night, order and chaos. The Olmecs may not have built the great stone ball courts familiar from later sites, but their offerings show that the game's deeper meaning was already in play. The courts of Copan and Chichen Itza, the sculpted reliefs of ball players and captives, the Aztec practice of sacrificing captives in ritual matches, all of these developments can be seen as elaborations of an Olmec foundation. The religious and cosmological patterns also resonate. Olmec art abounds in motifs of caves, jaguars, serpents, and infants with supernatural features. These images point to a worldview centered on fertility, rain, maize, and the cyclical renewal of life. Later Mesoamerican civilizations inherited and expanded this symbolic repertoire. The Maya rain god Chac, the Aztec Tlaloc, and the Teotihuacano storm deities all bear echoes of Olmec rain imagery. The jaguar, a creature of power and liminality, remained a central symbol throughout Mesoamerica, associated with shamans, warriors, and underworld forces. The feathered serpent, later Quetzalcoatl to the Aztecs and Kukulkan to the Maya, has antecedents in Olmec iconography, where serpent imagery combines with avian and feline elements. The Olmecs, in short, established a symbolic grammar that later cultures would elaborate into full theological systems. Some scholars have suggested alternative metaphors. Instead of mother culture, they speak of the Olmecs as the first among equals, the earliest to crystallize patterns that others would develop in parallel. Others describe them as a horizon culture, a society whose symbols spread across a wide region, creating a shared cultural vocabulary without enforcing uniformity. Still others prefer to avoid metaphors altogether, emphasizing the multiplicity of interactions across Mesoamerica. Each of these framings reflects an effort to capture the complexity of cultural transmission, how ideas move, how they are adopted, and how they are transformed. The very debate over the mother culture label illustrates a larger truth about archaeology. Interpretation is always shaped by language, and language carries metaphors that frame our understanding. To call the Olmecs the mother culture is to highlight their priority and influence. To call them a sister culture is to stress diversity and mutual exchange. Neither is entirely wrong, and neither is entirely sufficient. The task of this book is to navigate between these poles, presenting the Olmecs both as innovators whose achievements reverberated and as participants in a larger mosaic of ancient peoples. This tension also provides a roadmap for the chapters ahead. In the pages that follow, we will examine the Olmec world in its full complexity, its environment of swamps and rivers, its centers of San Lorenzo and La Venta, its art and monuments, its ritual practices, its networks of trade, and its eventual decline. At each step, we will ask not only what the Olmecs achieved in their own time, but how their patterns resonate with later civilizations. When we analyze the colossal heads, we will see them both as portraits of rulers in their own context and as prototypes for the divine kingship of the Maya and Aztecs. When we trace Olmec iconography, we will see both its local meanings and its echoes in later pantheons. When we study their urban planning, we will consider both the practical challenges of building on floodplains and the cosmological principles that endured in Teotihuacan and Tenochtitlan. The roadmap of this book follows the Olmecs from origins to legacy, but it also follows the historiography, how they were rediscovered, how they have been interpreted, and how debates about them continue to shape our understanding of Mesoamerican history. We will confront both the triumphs of archaeology, the recovery of buried offerings, the decoding of stratigraphy, and its limitations, the silences of texts never written, the uncertainty of symbols never fully explained. We will see how the Olmecs became symbols in modern Mexican identity, and how their image has been appropriated in speculative theories of lost continents and foreign voyagers. In short, we will engage the Olmecs not only as an ancient people, but as an ongoing presence in our collective imagination. In the end, whether we call them mother culture or not, the Olmecs compel us to grapple with the origins of civilization in the Americas. They stand at the threshold of Mesoamerican history, their achievements both foundational and enigmatic. They remind us that every civilization is both unique and part of a larger human story, that patterns repeat, ideas echo, and innovations reverberate across centuries. And they invite us to enter their world with humility, aware of what we know, what we suspect, and what remains forever out of reach. Calendrical reckoning and early writing also appear to trace back to Olmec innovations. Though the evidence is fragmentary, the Cascajal block suggests the Olmecs were experimenting with formalized signs centuries before Zapotec glyphs or Maya hieroglyphics. More securely, Olmec influenced regions show the earliest evidence for the long count calendar system, later perfected by the Maya. A stela from Tres Zapotes bears one of the earliest long count dates, placing the Olmecs at the dawn of Mesoamerican temporal science. Time itself, counted, ritualized, and tied to celestial cycles, was one of their legacies. When Maya scribes recorded histories across thousands of years, and when Aztec priests calculated the 260-day ritual calendar, they were heirs to patterns first articulated in Olmec society. Urban planning offers another line of continuity. Olmec centers such as La Venta show evidence of careful orientation, with plazas and mounds aligned to cardinal directions and possibly celestial events. This concern for cosmic order in urban design becomes unmistakable at Teotihuacan, whose Avenue of the Dead aligns with sacred mountains and astronomical points, and at Maya sites such as Waxacton, where temples mark solstices and equinoxes. The Aztecs, too, built Tenochtitlan as a cosmogram, its Templo Mayor representing the duality of rain and war gods, its causeways linking to the four cardinal directions. The Olmecs, by aligning earthworks to cosmic principles, set the stage for a tradition of sacred urbanism that defined Mesoamerican civilization. Debates continue about how direct this inheritance was. Some scholars argue for diffusion, that Olmec priests, artisans, or traders spread these ideas across regions, planting seeds that later cultures cultivated. Others argue for parallel development, that different societies arrived at similar solutions independently, drawing on shared agricultural and ecological challenges. Yet the weight of evidence leans toward continuity. The spread of Olmec-style motifs to distant sites, the early presence of long-count dates in Olmec regions, and the striking parallels in cosmological imagery all point to a cultural horizon in which the Olmecs played a leading role. This influence does not mean later cultures were mere copies. The Maya, with their intricate writing and astronomy, far surpassed the Olmecs in intellectual sophistication. Teotihuacan, with its vast city of stone, dwarfed La Venta in scale. The Aztecs, with their imperial system and ritual sacrifices, created a world of unmatched intensity. Yet each of these civilizations built upon a foundation first laid in the Gulf Coast lowlands. They inherited not the details but the principles, that cities are sacred landscapes, that rulers embody cosmic order, that rituals sustain the cosmos, and that art and architecture serve as channels between human and divine. In this sense, the Olmecs are less the mother culture than the first articulation of a Mesoamerican pattern, a set of themes that would be replayed, reinterpreted, and magnified over 2,000 years. Their legacy is not found in direct lines of descent, but in resonances across time, echoes that connect the clay mound of La Venta to the stone pyramids of Teotihuacan, the carved throne of San Lorenzo to the stele of Copan, the jaguar infant to the Aztec rain god's mask. To study the Olmecs is to glimpse the first draft of Mesoamerican civilization, a draft whose themes would be revised but never erased. The phrase mother culture has become inseparable from discussions of the Olmecs. It is a phrase that conjures images of origins, of roots, of a singular parent civilization birthing all that followed. To some, it captures the profound influence the Olmecs exerted upon later peoples. To others, it is a misleading simplification, flattening the mosaic of ancient Mesoamerica into a hierarchy of inheritance. As with so many terms in archaeology, the phrase has both clarified and distorted, guided inquiry, and sparked fierce resistance. To properly situate the Olmecs within history, we must examine not only what the label reveals, but also what it obscures. The use of mother culture in Mesoamerican scholarship rose in the mid-20th century, alongside the dramatic excavations at San Lorenzo and La Venta. Matthew Stirling and his colleagues argued, on the basis of colossal heads, buried offerings, and early radiocarbon dates, that the Olmecs were the progenitors of later traditions. They seem to stand at the beginning of time in the Americas, their monuments centuries older than Maya pyramids or Zapotec inscriptions. The idea of a mater cultura was appealing, particularly in a scholarly climate shaped by the search for origins, whether of agriculture in the Near East, writing in Mesopotamia, or dynastic kingship in Egypt. To call the Olmecs the mother culture was to insert them into a global narrative of first beginnings, to give Mesoamerica its own equivalent of Sumer or Egypt. Yet almost immediately, the phrase raised objections. Critics noted that the metaphor of motherhood implied a one-way transmission of ideas, as though the Olmecs gave birth to later civilizations in a linear progression. But Mesoamerican history was never so tidy. The Zapotecs of Mani Alban developed writing independently, drawing on local traditions even as they borrowed Olmec motifs. The highland cultures of central Mexico evolved their own urban centers, influenced but not dictated by Gulf Coast precedents. The Maya created an intellectual world of extraordinary complexity, far surpassing anything preserved in Olmec remains. To call the Olmecs the mother culture risked diminishing the creativity and autonomy of these later peoples. The metaphor also carried unintended political overtones. In mid-20th century Mexico, where national identity was being reshaped through archaeology, the Olmecs became symbols of antiquity and unity. To present them as the mother of all later Mexicans was to offer a powerful narrative of shared heritage, but in doing so, it sometimes obscured regional diversity, imposing a centralized genealogy onto a past that was far more plural. Anthropologists and indigenous groups alike cautioned against this flattening, reminding us that identity is always complex and origins are rarely singular. Despite these critiques, the label has persisted, not least because it captures something undeniably true. The Olmecs did set precedents that echoed for millennia. Their monumental architecture prefigured the great ceremonial centers of Teotihuacan, and the Maya lowlands. Their symbolic vocabulary, jaguars, serpents, cleft mountains, was absorbed into the cosmologies of countless later peoples. Their rulers modeled a form of sacral kingship that became a hallmark of Mesoamerican political thought. To deny their foundational role would be to ignore overwhelming evidence of continuity. The challenge, then, is not to discard the label entirely, but to use it with nuance, aware of both its power and its limits.